So I'm Michelle Freeman, this is Jermaine Jenkins, and we both co-host Urban Consulate here in Philadelphia. Thank you all for being here. The format of this event is a little bit different tonight, and we're really excited to be hosting some really great featured guests and to share a little film with you as well. We kind of rotate around and do different events. One of those events is this monthly salon series called City Lobby, and that's where you are now. I would say about a year ago, we hosted, I think it was last fall, we hosted a conversation about ethical redevelopment when some of the Philadelphia cohort was in the midst of the program. So we kind of checked in with them to see how things were going, and now, a year later, they've kind of wrapped up with the formal sort of convening part of the ethical redevelopment salon series. So now we're really here to hear from them about how that all went and to talk to them really about where they are in their work now, how what they've gone through has informed their work, and also open it up really to all of you to help contribute to that dialogue. So we really do try to promote as much as we can a conversational kind of vibe in these events and these discussions. So just to give you a little rundown of the format, we are going to show this 20-minute short film that Place Lab in the University of Chicago, who hosts the Ethical Redevelopment Salon Series, has got together. I believe it's not released yet publicly, so this is the Philadelphia premiere of this, so just know that. But we do want to show you this film because it does give really great context to the principles that are taught and practiced in this program, and also gives you some additional perspective, not only from some of the Philadelphia members, but nationally, the other cities where we have some other members that are represented in this film.
Ethical redevelopment is a set of principles that make the case for more mindful city building. By utilizing cross-city networks and cross-sector innovation, ethical redevelopment encapsulates a philosophy to shift the value system from conventional, profit-driven development practices to conscientious interventions in the urban context. Place Lab is funded by a 3-year grant from the Knight Foundation and distills and documents the unique approach to community practice that artist Theaster Gates has developed over the course of his career. Place Lab shares his insights to a wider audience that could utilize them through their own work in cities and communities across the country. Place Lab is part of the University of Chicago's Arts and Public Life Initiative in the neighborhood of Washington Park. Through ethical redevelopment, this practice has been articulated by a set of 9 principles that were drawn from Gates's and others' artist-led, neighborhood-based development work on Chicago's South Side. Place Lab introduced the 9 principles in the early stages of development in order to share and refine with other willing urban practitioners who believe in spatial equity for cities. The sharing began with a public convening at the University of Chicago in June 2016 and brought together artists, academics, and professionals across a wide spectrum of community practice to expound on their ideas about what ethical redevelopment meant to them and where opportunities exist to expand our collective work beyond its current limits. It set a tone that this work is by many, for many, and that arts, culture, and equity are centrally important to conversations about city building. After the public convening, Place Lab hosted a series of 9 conversations, each centralized around one of the 9 principles of ethical redevelopment. Place Lab invited a cohort of 35 practitioners from around the country, many from Knight cities, in addition to local partners, guest experts, artists, writers, and more to participate in these salon sessions. Over the course of the 9 salon sessions, over 100 people came to the Stony Island Arts Bank for presentations, workshops, tours, films, and critical conversations. Participants heard presentations from the field and engaged in conversation about the complicated values and sometimes messy process of community and urban practice. The wide range of perspectives that exist within the field, including community activists, organizers, artists, architects, urban planners, developers, and funders, were heard from during the series. Groups also toured the spaces that Theaster and his team have worked on in Chicago, in addition to several other important local, analogous projects.
I think I'll just share a little bit about why we're doing this So we were given $3.5 million by Night to, in some ways, demonstrate that Night cities were already resilient, but also to like, instead of us bumping around to every Night city, to create a situation where Night city dwellers could learn from one another, and maybe we could demonstrate tonight that like, while one way is sending in like Kinsey or the Kinsey group or something, and like having consultants and whatever, another way might be actually getting everybody in the room, letting everybody talk to each other. And so, in a way, I feel like we've proven a case. There are other ways of getting peer learning to shared action to deeper understanding of how processes work with projects. But I think that as a result of kind of taking a stab into this kind of structural darkness, I've gained some new friendships and allies. I found myself much more excited about the people than about the project or about the structures that we created in order to get you all here. And that has to do with the tremendous amount of deep investment you all have made, and that we've kind of accidentally created something where we could actually do much bigger than the grant required. That there's actually some capacity to, across this country, these cities that we represent, towns that we represent, that we could actually do something much more interesting than the requirements of our funders.
Like my bossy, I speak my bossy, I speak Trina and Cardi B, I speak woman runs the house, I speak field and house, I speak house, Chicago, Chicago, red line, lingering lick, I speak sharp sword, Bible translations and revenues, I speak avenues and boulevards, Cabrini when I cook, LeClaire Courts on 26th in California, I speak free my mans, I speak free my energy and concrete queendom.
I think a really powerful takeaway has been for me, well, one, building a relationship with people who have eyes and ears on the streets in multiple, spaces around the country. And then looking at some of the same manifestations of how communities are dealt with through fresh eyes or through different regions. And feeling like there is a power in learning that there are other like-minded people who are asking questions in these spaces and trying to figure out best practices.
Like to you and our friends now. Like I'm looking forward to going to Philly, and I'd always heard about Philly as another great night city, and I was like, well, screw Philly, we don't want to beat Philly. But having an affection for it, and I'm excited to go and interact with folks and see what kind of work that we can do together on the ground.
I think about that ripple mapping effect when you meet somebody and you create a relationship with them and then they draw you into their networks and vice versa, that I think the power of the leadership that's happening between the salon members in different cities and what's possible, maintaining these friendships and looking out for each other, sending each other opportunities that might arise that might be beneficial.
I had a really great conversation with an architect, just sort of learning about some of the challenges that they go through in terms of funding, resources, some of the challenges within their projects. And there's so many parallels between some of the struggles we've had as a collective doing social practice here in Philadelphia. And I think sort of just having that camaraderie in terms of challenges and opportunities and sort of how they went about resolving those issues. And I think that's been incredibly helpful in figuring out how we're going to sort of move forward with our project.
It's nice to know we're not alone in this, and it's nice to hear from our friends in Detroit, to hear that Philadelphia's doing some things right. I can't think of another context where I feel completely free to pick up the phone and call someone and ask how they're doing in their city, or what's not working, or what's working, or how we can be useful to each other.
Like, it's nice to see that other folks are thinking about how we can approach our work on a more broad scale, so it's just not a specialty that we think about this, but it's actually the standard.
The things I was feeling when I was trying to overcome my challenge, other folks were feeling those same things.
For me, the salon sessions was something that allowed me to more closely define what I was doing.
A lot of times when we're doing this work, there's like just one or two of us doing it at an organization. For me, I was just one for a really long time. We always talk about in Detroit doing work in silos, so you're just in your little hovel doing your work with your head down, banging it against the wall, like, why doesn't anyone understand me? But then you could go to these sessions and be like, oh, there are others. So it was really great to not just commiserate, but kind of get validation for like your frustrations.
It was one really good one moment when we were convening as a group, the Detroit group, and someone was explaining the challenge they were having with acquiring a piece of property, and were frustrated with the land bank. And someone said, well, here's how you could frame that. Someone who worked for the city said, here's how you can maybe think about framing that. It might give you a better chance. And so it just gave that opportunity for a solution to be thought through in an environment that we probably wouldn't have had otherwise.
And being able to make connections with these networks of people from different cities really positively benefited my mental health and my ability to stay driven and focused and affirmed and empowered, that doing work with and for the community in a participatory way was really the only way that the work should be approached. Pointing that out to my organization and other leaders in the area with the confidence that the ethical redevelopment salons have given me has been very significant in changing the path of the work.
There's the benefit of validation, and as simple as it sounds, being connected to a network of people who are from different cities, to the University of Chicago, to the work of Place Lab, is very significant in terms of moving levers on work that we're doing here in the Twin Cities.
And then also, it just challenged me to think at scale. You're constantly reminded that it's not just Detroit, but you got folks from Lexington, from Philly, from all around the country who are all singing the same song, quote unquote. You start to realize like this isn't a Detroit thing, and it's like okay, then you start to ask yourself, okay, how is it that in 50 different markets around the country you can have the same challenges faced by pretty much the same people? And so you start to realize if there's a scalable challenge, then there has to be a scalable solution. And it just made me think about my work from the outside in versus from the inside out.
I saw so many other people who were doing similar things, not the same things, but similar things, just really making places better off and people better off. And that just kind of like turned on a light inside of me and really just allowed me to see that I really needed to continue to do what I was doing. Not just because folks in Akron thinks it's cool, but it has a bigger purpose, and it's part of a network of little lights that are turning on all over the country, and I'm pretty sure all over the world.
I'm not afraid to tell the First Precinct and the Downtown Improvement District and city council members and business owners that we need to work together to do something different, or we're going to get what we've always had. We don't have time to not really face the conversations that need to be had about the inequity of our downtown, especially in West Downtown.
Which was one of the things that we talk about in Detroit too. Like, there's a lot of folks who are doing great things but aren't asking for help. And there's a lot of folks that are asking for help, and if they actually got the help, getting you ready to go. So one of our principles is like, if you're gonna talk about it, be about it.
Giving a language to work that we're doing and giving a sort of a context. So we know we're doing all sorts of interesting things through the Reimagine Pacific Commons project around leveraging resources and connecting different types of spaces and communities and organizations, but we didn't necessarily have the language for that.
So it helped put language to some of the things that I already felt, but couldn't quite articulate to certain folks. So it was helpful in that sense that it put the right words in my brain that I could use for future reference. I think what the Place Lab Fellowship did was just give it, that kind of structure that allows you to talk about it with other people, and trying to explain your work is really challenging, but now you have principles that you can list that help people that aren't in this field or that have been doing the work but not thinking about those things. It gives them some context. After the last session, I'm kind of realizing that I've created a platform. So Principle 9, platforms. We're really just like holding the space to bring together stakeholders, like people from the anchor institutions in our neighborhood, with residents, and a platform for that didn't exist. So yeah, we've created a platform, but I never would have known. I wouldn't have had a dialogue for it if I hadn't gone to those sessions. Now I'm like, I create platforms.
So there's like this two-sided conversation, like without giving like an exact example, but I have experienced this. There's a conversation you might have, let's say the staff of a councilman and a real estate developer, and then there's a conversation you have with a community and a councilman staff and a real estate developer, and they're two total discussions. And frankly, until we educate both sides about our shared history and the effects of some of the manifestations we do to develop cities, and create empathy outside of our existing safe spaces, that's where the really hard and heavy work needs to be done.
But then you understand that those principles mean different things to different folks, whether they're a challenge to a developer to say, if you're gonna come into a community and develop, here's how you're gonna do it, or a challenge to someone who's in a community who wants to develop to say, here's the tools you can use to start to put together your own capacity and advocate for yourself.
I think when you get everybody on the same page, it's a better look. I see it all the time. People throw events and nobody shows up and they're like, well, where is everybody? Don't they appreciate this? And it's just like, well, maybe they didn't need that. Maybe they didn't need, whatever it was, maybe they need something else. And if you're at the same page as you're asking folks what they actually need or want, then you can start to service them better. I feel like having the same language and getting on the same page will allow that to happen. I think it allows for a cross appreciation between both the developers or initiators and the users and the residents.
Stack, leverage, access. The most efficient way to finance affordable housing is to have the government just write a check for the total cost of development, just like a single-payer system is the most efficient way to deliver health care. Unfortunately, in both cases, there isn't sufficient political will to support what makes the most sense. Instead, we make developers go through an intricate dance, contorting themselves and our projects to satisfy the often conflicting funding priorities of 4, 5, 6, even 10 different funding sources.
We were doing projects out in the social sphere prior, and still now, but it was kind of like trial and error and learn as you go and kind of like fudge yourself through and try and think from the outside, the kind of collaborations and negotiations that you're gonna need across the civic sphere to achieve some of these grand scale kind of multi-lane projects, so being able to go to Chicago and be immersed in that room where the diversity was clear from the offset, because it just lets you know from the offset that these are the kind of ingredients that you need in order to achieve kind of these grand scale architecture, engineer involved projects, but you don't know that without being able to kind of get immersed within that environment, and be able to kind of utilize that intellectual capital.
I think the first thing is that nobody's right. I've worked in a couple of different capacities. I've worked for CDC as a community organizer. I've worked as a volunteer. I've worked for an economic development entity that was quasi-governmental. And I've been an entrepreneur and a developer. So I kind of see these things from all those different perspectives. And I think you have to have that to really talk about any one issue, because other than that, you get one kind of lane looking at a multi-lane issue.
Kind of seeing your team has inspired me thinking about our team. It just inspired me thinking about how to grow a network and how maybe to have a different perspective about teams.
I feel like this city is full of folks like similar to me but before the salon, they don't have the structure, they've got the passion and the fire, but they've never seen anyone except for Africans do what we're doing here. Had they seen some projects like out in Detroit, that would be a different thing. I think that it would round the circle out a little bit more for them.
What's funny is Eric Howard, he lives here, and we are always so busy, but we chat with him and we catch up, and he's like, he was on the advisory committee for Peter Hart, being close enough, going back and forth to salons or meeting at salons, it helped boost our time together, which is nice. So we collaborated on the idea of getting kids out of Detroit and having them explore other areas and then bringing them back to tables around the city to help inform decision making. I would like to spread the wealth a little bit though. What I would love to happen is some kind of validation for neighborhood residents that want to participate in this. So a lot of the people that we call to the table to help us make decisions on what's going on in the Northwest don't have a degree in planning. So when they're sitting around the table, a lot of people don't look at them in the same way that they look at the rest of us. And I'm like, no, that person has knowledge that is equally as valuable. And I feel like if there could be some kind of certification for Ms. Jenkins down the street, then that validates her presence at the table.
It's one thing to create empathy and to create discussions, but ultimately you need to educate the populace to be able to move towards affecting public policy. I think that's like the higher goal ultimately of our project. I've been thinking a lot about like what is the next step for my partner and I after the redlining project. And redlining, I think existed in something like 1,600 municipalities around the country. So like how could what we've learned from our experience be linked into other markets to tell that story? I think it would be really interesting.
I think it's helped with thinking about more of a long-term project, sort of laying the groundwork for something that could potentially grow and be more sustainable by sort of sharpening our dialogue with the community so that I have a more focused concept.
We've thought about our project, growing exponentially now, and we've also thought about different kind of think tanks and analysis that we feel are needed that we can kind of launch locally.
There was a panel talk led by a person who's running for city council in a neighborhood near mine called Ethical Development. And I went to that panel talk, which featured various neighbors and artists and leaders talking about gentrification and about development issues and all of the things that we'd been talking about over the course of the year. And they were blown away. And when I told them that I'd been coming to Place Lab monthly, meeting with all of these different people, really the desire for that learning was so strong.
I had a young man who's a community activist say, God, there's just got to be a guidebook or something. And, of course, connected him to the principles and the information that was online. But there's, a whole host of people who are ready for more information, who could be really well impacted by this work. And so finding the right ways to do that within people's local communities would be a wonderful way to continue. Continuing in the work of ethical redevelopment and the principles is not going to happen organically. It's, there is going to need to be some structure and process to move this forward in a powerful way in local communities and to continue to convene the network so that it has real impact over time.
Children of the ghetto, always in the news. Toughness is the motto, bitter are their blues.
And then what does it mean to invent structures in the absence of a government or a philanthropy or a private individual being willing to help lay those structures down? What does it mean for us to start to invent structures that initially are just like baby leaves and turn into branches and turn into roots and turn into like strong timber, right? And that structures don't just land. They take hard work and a kind of slow growth to create the necessary infrastructure whereby a place might change from the inside. That takes time.
But while we're fighting, capitalism is still happening. Development's still happening. You know, the money is still figuring out how to do what it does. So what's our real end game here? And how do we get focused about that and stay focused about that and work toward, you know, understanding what is the real goal of ethical redevelopment? Who's it for? What is it about? Is it about getting better at certain things in the short term? Sure. In the long term, is it about, like, to some degree, putting ourselves out of business to where we don't have to constantly advocate for a community because that community is equipped to advocate for itself? Definitely. But there's steps to that, and I think starting now to identify some of those steps and even kind of fan out in some of those different teams that are deployed, you know, toward that same end game, fighting on different fronts, in a cohesive, collaborative way, I think is going to be important.
That kind of ethical redevelopment, if that's a set of ideas, those ideas need to materialize into something that then allows people kind of tactical, strategic opportunity to kind of get inside of it, right? And so, you know, ethical redevelopment in a sense, or at least the salon becomes the platform of these principles that we've been talking about. And I think that for me, the idea, like if we were to just go back to development, whatever development or redevelopment, whatever we imagine that to be, that I always felt like there were these ways in which development could yield more. And so I think that for me, the creation of structures, whether they're building structures or organizational structures or networks, it feels like that's all preconditions that will allow then people to flourish, me to flourish, culture to flourish, lives to have new opportunities, new resources to come into a place.
And the rest of the Grace Lab Salon Series.
Hi, everybody.
Good evening, everybody. Y'all hear me? Y'all hear me? There we go. So welcome. Speaking of welcome, so we went out to Chicago. We were all welcomed at Chicago University and at the Place Lab experience to get the opportunity to do fair and equitable development, or at least talk about it. And one of the major takeaways from the experience that made it real was, just like a room like this, the people in the room actually had been through the experience. So you got to see the real life cause and effect. And from that experience, we got to literally talk to people. We talked about crime. The people that were affected by crime were in the room as a part of the conversation and were ultimately leading the conversation. And then
So I'm gonna give a little contextualization, just in terms of like an example when he speaks of crime. So one of the most powerful experiences that, for me personally, I think I went to Chicago 8 times between August and June of last year. And we got to do a workshop with all the gentlemen who were part of the Chicago Torture Center. So a lot of people don't know, and I wasn't aware of it prior to this experience, that there was a famous police chief in Chicago who was found guilty of torturing African American men from 1972 until probably about 1994. And these men were a part of a suit that got them $5 million to create a space in a museum to basically tell that history. So to be in a workshop with people who actually experienced torture And when I say torture, I mean like they actually cattle prodded black men in the city of Chicago that they just picked up off of the streets in like stop and search type manifestations. And to hear them have the courage to talk about going through torture, state-sponsored torture, and to, you know, fight and lose and fight and lose and go through the heavy lifting of getting $5 million to kind of create the space to tell that history, was a really humbling experience. Because when you think about, like, you know, people talk about courage or people talk about doing the work, but to have somebody, you know, and for Theaster and the University of Chicago and Knight Foundation, these institutions, to put you in that space, it was one of the times I came away, it was like, I don't think I've ever experienced anything like that in Philadelphia. You know, like, I've never experienced anyone talking about the Move 9 or the worldwide perspective of Mumia, or, you know, you can contextualize that to like Place Lab, not Place Lab, but Monument Lab, and the conversations that we have about space. So, I'll let you.
From that experience, there was a center created. The children and grandchildren, the people that went through that experience, had the opportunity to go to community college free of charge. So in that room, you had the cause, and you had the effect, and you had a real conversation that people were willing to have in a safe space. So with that as a small backdrop, we're going to have the people who went through the experience with us take the time to tell you who they are and give some insight to the things they learned along the way.
You want to kick it off, Ken?
Sure. Thank you for having all of us. My name is Kevin Moran, and I'm the Executive Director at the Fairmount Community Development Corporation. I'll start by saying our office is on Girard Avenue at near 29th and Girard. So that automatically always gets some head rolls. Fairmount CDC, what are you doing? What are you doing at 29th and Girard, right? And so I'd like to sort of put that out there head on. So we work really closely with our partners in Brewerytown. And as an organization, we focus a lot on supporting the small businesses along our commercial corridors, along West Girard Avenue and along Fairmount Avenue as well. And so that's why we're on West Girard Avenue. But I think coming out of this experience, the one thing that I've been thinking a lot about that I don't necessarily have a solution for just yet, but you know, I think as an organization, Fairmount CDC has always kind of prided ourselves on being able to get things done. We were, you know, the city could funnel contracts to us, and we would have a program up and running relatively quickly. We would be delivering metrics that would be, you know, impressive to the folks who set those metrics. And I think that's important. That's organizational capacity that is important to develop. But coming out of this experience, I started to really question and really consider who is around the table while we are getting stuff done. And so I think the big thing for me was really taking the time to evaluate all of our programs, and I'm continuing to sort of take time to step back and evaluate all of our programs, look at who they're touching, and then also look at who's around the table in the designing of those programs, and who's around the table in discussing how those programs get implemented. And they're really varied. They can be anything from streetscape enhancements, really physical stuff, to our special events and making sure our events are you know, not just me and my board thinking they're inclusive, but making sure the folks who we hope are attending our events are finding them inclusive as well. And then some technical assistance that we're providing for our businesses. Are the programs and the things that we're offering our businesses designed in such a way that they benefit not just the folks who have been opening along West Girard and eastward on Fairmount for, you know, over the last couple of years, but are the technical assistance and the resources that we're providing our businesses equally available to the businesses who have called Brewerytown or Fairmount home for the past, you know, 25, 30, 50 years. So that's, you know, that's sort of what I stepped away from the sort of collective Place Lab experience, the 4 or 5 trips that I had out to Chicago. And it's not something that I have perfect answers or perfect solutions to, but it's something that we are certainly, or I am certainly, more intentional about in the evaluation of our programs. Not just are we meeting the grant requirements, but are we meeting the grant requirements and then perhaps the unwritten sort of duty that we have, or the duty that we have to the neighborhood and the people who live there.
No, okay. It's hard to follow both of you guys, so it's very, very intimidating. My name is Jennifer Mahar, and I am the Senior Director of Civic Initiatives at the Fairmount Park Conservancy. We are a very young organization. We're less than 20 years old. And in the last 5 years, we've really shifted our work. We shifted from a fundraising organization for fancy capital projects like the Waterworks to doing more community-based work at Hunting Park, in East Parkside, and neighborhoods all throughout the city. So one thing people don't know about the Conservancy is that we are citywide. We work in parks all across the system, not just what is known as East and West Fairmount Park. The past couple of years, we've really shifted the conversation about what a park means to a community. So rather than what does the park need, does it need tree work or sidewalks or playgrounds, we shifted the conversation from what does the park need to what does the community need from the park. So most of my efforts, and still not enough effort, is spending time with the community organizations that border the park. So I spend a lot of time with the Centennial Parkside CDC trying to come up with ways, well, how can this $4 million project across the street bring jobs to the community? How can we get you a home in Letitia House in a historic property so that you can operate effectively, so you can run programs? Really trying to think and rethink and re-envision what the park can be to the community. It's very new, it's messy, I screw up every darn day, but I think the validation and just knowing that we have to try to rethink our work has been really impactful. So I could go on forever just about all our stuff, but I want to make sure we have time for discussion. So it's a brief overview about me.
All right, well, thank you everybody for coming tonight. This is a great turnout and a great topic. My name is Lindsay Scanapico, and I'm the Managing Director of SCOUT. We are a multidisciplinary design and development practice, and we are behind currently the redevelopment of the old Bach building in South Philadelphia. For people who aren't familiar with the building, Bach was built in 1936. It was a historic vocational school. It was closed by the city of Philadelphia in 2013. It was one of 32 schools closed here in Philadelphia. But what's really I think interesting, challenging, scary is that although in Philadelphia we had 32 schools closed, this isn't a Philadelphia problem. Detroit, I think, had over 100. Chicago had 45. I was on the phone this week with people in Memphis talking about how to reuse closed schools. And schools were built to be a center of our communities. That was their intention. And so the question about what you do with a closed school facility, I think, is a really challenging one. I didn't have a background in real estate development. My background was in urban design, and we kind of thought about how could we use the infrastructure and value that already existed in the building in a different way. So for example, looking at an old wood shop and saying, could a woodworker use that? Looking at the old culinary arts training kitchen, could that be a place for a catering business to thrive and grow? Today we have 96 tenants in the building. It's a 340,000 square foot facility. Of that, 45% of our tenants are people who have grown from their living room. So this is their first kind of step into a business that they've started. Over 15% of the building is nonprofits. Over 85% of our tenants live within 1 mile of the building, so it's very much a local center. And out of our first 50 tenants, we created 31 new jobs that were not in another jurisdiction. They were really people growing from their living room to their first space to their next bigger space. And so the intention is to be a building that supports a wide variety of different people because of the scale. We don't think it should ever be one type of thing. So it's not just the building for artists or the building for nonprofits or the building for makers. It can kind of be all of that and more. And the idea is, did that go out? Is that it can be, that it should be constantly evolving, that it should be richly diverse, that it should be a place that, yes, we do have commercial realities to meet at the end of the day, but that we can also be have social vitality, that we can be a place that embraces a range of different things and tries to think about what that can mean, and how can you actually reimagine. How do you take a school that was built so that nobody could see what's going on inside of it and try to open it up, and the challenges that come with that. Perhaps best known though for the bar on the roof, which is been a surprising, I guess, success, and also an opportunity for us in terms of actually a subsidy that kind of supports the rest of the building. And so for us, it's all about balance and trying to find opportunities for that in a challenging old building with lots of infrastructure. But I think one of the things that I really took away from our sessions was the idea that although we came to the building with a plan, we didn't have a prescriptive plan, for example, of where somebody in the building should sit. So I had banks asking me, can you take a floor plan and say where everyone, like, you know, what's going to be where, what's going to be in this space, what's going to be in that space? And I was like, I have no idea, to be honest. I think it's going to be all these types of things. And that was really challenging for us to explain to people who were trying to get as investors. But at the same time, I think that one of the things that really resonated me from the sessions was something that Theester said, which was to take the master out of master plan and allowing buildings and spaces to develop organically and for them to respond to needs that we didn't even know existed. And so I think that that's an important part of the project, and I really found a lot of support and inspiration from that and from many of the sessions at Place Lab that are always challenging us to think harder about what development can actually do for a neighborhood and thinking beyond the boundaries of our fortress in South Philly.
Cool. Thank you. So to speak a little bit about Theester, and I can't speak enough about the Place Lab team and how they have an interdisciplinary knowledge and powerful way of engaging with community. Like, they put us in front of so many different people who are attempting to or already have made like transformative change in their community. And funny enough, I met Theester in 2011 at a conference in Utah. And the first time we met, it became a series of actions that repeated themselves. So he was smoking a cigarette about, I would say, a mountain range, probably about a block and a half from me. And I saw somebody calling to him, and they said, "Hey, Taib." But I was like on a porch where like nobody could see me, and I was like, "Oh, that's funny, they're calling Theester Taib." And that was like the first of a series of times where people would always confuse us. And then the next time was, I think, at a museum here in Philadelphia. He got up and he spoke, and he's super performative and engaging. And after he spoke, he went outside, and then like all these white people ran up and they were like, "You were fucking amazing." And then at first I was just, I was like, oh, we both kind of look Ghanaian, like it happens all the time. And then I was on a bus tour in Chicago, and he wasn't actually in sight. And I walked into one of his buildings, and like the dude who does security kind of looked at me because I didn't say hi, and he was like, "You ain't gonna say what's up?" And I was like, "Oh, it's real." Like, so at that time, Theester was like a growing artist, and I didn't really understand completely what he did. But then in 2013 or 14, Knight Foundation invited me out for like a think tank. And by that time, he had 55 buildings in his portfolio, from performance art spaces to his studio to this project called the Dorchester Homes, which is like a mixed income, but I think traditionally was what we would have called in Philadelphia like a project, where all of the artists who have housing there have to do some type of programming. And we had a moment where like no one else was around, and I pulled him aside. I said, "Theester, let me talk to you for a minute. Like, yo, I saw you 3 years ago, and you did not have all this going on. Like, what is going on? Where did you get this business acumen?" And he looked at me like we were on a trail on a runaway. He was like, "Yo, I don't have the business acumen you think. If there's anything you see me doing, just copy it and run with it and say I support it." And I was like, that was so empowering to me, because particularly like people have a tendency, like when you ask them a question, they're like, oh, well, you know, I had this vision. You know, like, oh, well, if you would just be my mentee for a year. Yeah, he was straight up, he was like, yo, I'm just trying shit and it's working. And like, you can be down, just run with him, put shit together, bro. And he just has this really engaging way of being supportive and you know, trying things out and almost getting out of the way a lot. And that's one of the big takeaways I've witnessed from interacting with the Place Lab team, Rebuild Foundation, and Theastra is he will set up his team and get out of the way. And that's one of my most powerful takeaways. And the last thing I'm gonna say is Stony Arts Bank was a space that was unoccupied for 30 years, like a lot of spaces we have in the city. Beautiful building, had a rotting roof, had about 4 feet of water in the basement at one point, and they were about to demolish it, and he became aware of it because it was in the footprint where he was doing a lot of work. He was able to work out a deal with the mayor's administration and acquire the building for $1. And then he came up with a scheme, I'll call it a scheme, and he sold art and got a group of philanthropic organizations to put together a fund to support the building. And then he got the Johnson & Johnson publishing collection, which is like all of the books that were submitted to Ebony magazine over 35 years, donated to him. And he put that in this bank. And then he got 5,000 records that were donated to him that were all of the vinyl collection of Frankie Knuckles, who a lot of you, if you know anything about house music, is a legend. And he put that in the bank. And he started putting all these things in the bank where now, if you visit this space, I would say it's on par with walking into the PMA or to the Barnes or to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art. But the thing that is a really big takeaway that's like viscerally after my first time experiencing and going there is when you walk out and you look at all of this Black history, you're in the south side of Chicago. You're not downtown. You know, you're in the neighborhoods that experience urban renewal. You're in the neighborhoods that experience redlining. And for him to take his agency and his power and his basic sanction by the philanthropic industrial complex, yeah, I said it, and put that into the Black community was a really powerful thing for me to take home and reimagine like what type of work I'm gonna do in the future.
So I like the fact that you're okay with Theaster saying just run with it and use his name, because I do that with you all the time. I say that Ty said, it's okay. Ty said he's going to co-sign. All right, so I'm glad you guys are laughing. That's very important because this is not PBS. You guys are allowed to ask questions. So if you're having a question, you can just put a hand up. I'll come over and talk. There are 9 principles that make up our Place Lab experience. I don't know why I'm talking so soft, but my favorite principle is constellations. Primarily because it's the idea that as you, as the person that's doing the work, achieves some kind of recognition, then it becomes about you and less about the people you're doing it for. So I'm a Black guy, I'm from Philly, I'm a little nervous about that because, a little guilt. I made it out. I want other people to learn how to make it out too and accomplish their dreams, right? So as much as I love speaking on panels and going to Chicago, I love the fact that you get more information. And I'm always wary of that. And that's an easy hole to fall within, right? So that's my favorite principle because it keeps me balanced. Like, Akeem, you're going to Chicago, you're going to Toronto, but it's not about you, guy. It's about the other people who don't have the information. So, the esteemed panel, we're going to start with you, Lindsay, because I know you're going to try to pass it off to Kev. What's your favorite principle?
Yeah, so I think that for me, something that really resonated with the work that we're doing was the indeterminate, because I think that a lot of times development, and particularly when you're talking about a physical asset, there isn't a lot of acceptance, support for the indeterminate. If you tell somebody, I don't know what's going to happen in this space, or we'll see how somebody can use that space, that's not accepted. Like, a bank isn't cool with that. The city isn't really cool with that. L&I isn't very cool with that. So I think that this idea of actually allowing flexibility and room for things to grow, for things to evolve in ways that you don't know and that you can't know and you shouldn't know, was really, really important for me. And I think it's actually a really important principle of this approach to development, which is that this idea of kind of having a single vision or a single person saying this is what this space should be. And yes, there's times and there's spaces where you have to do some of that, and actually Fiester is great at saying that he very much will admit that there's been situations and times where he's had to paint a full picture, but he's like has no idea that's actually how it's going to look. It's just it's part of the process. But I actually think that idea of the indeterminate, accepting the unknown, and allowing other things to inform, and admit when you're wrong, and allowing things to change is really important, and is a really important principle that of this work that I don't think is really embraced in development as kind of traditionally.
So I have to first admit that before coming to today's panel, I stopped and I watched the little video they have on the Place Lab website to make sure I properly could recite my 9 principles. And I swear it's not because I wasn't paying attention the 4 or 5 times I was out there. They really do have a way of sort of blending into one another. And so it's really kind of challenging to pick just one out. But I think the one that I would say I find most useful and that resonates most with the work that I'm doing today at Fairmount CDC is platforms, because it's really challenging for me to imagine Fairmount CDC, which is a relatively small organization, putting together the financing to acquire a building to do this really kind of transformational real estate project. I'm not saying it will never be done, but it's as a tiny 1.5 person operation with a relatively minuscule budget. It's not happening tomorrow, and so the question was so what leverage do we have to be change makers, and what leverage do we have to kind of to usher these ethical redevelopment principles into the communities that we're working in. And that's a really long way of getting to platforms is my favorite one, because I think platforms, the way that I've sort of come to understand platforms is that we can provide a foundation for a number of individuals or organizations to come in to use our space, that we can sort of connect the resources that we do have, which tend to be more human capital in nature and less financial capital in nature, that we can sort of help them grow. And as they grow, we sort of create stronger organizations all throughout the neighborhood. So whether it's working with a community garden, or it's working with a collection of artists, or if it's working with someone who grew up in Brewery Town and is becoming a real estate developer herself, and helping to kind of grow her capabilities. Then that's a way that we'll be able to grow our mission and grow our work without having the sort of financial burden or the financial requirements that we simply don't have. And that, again, hopefully one day we will, but that day is not tomorrow. So I think platforms was the principle that I'm most connected with as where we have the most leverage in supporting these types of principles in our communities.
Thanks for not choosing mine. I appreciate that. I think the two that stand out for me are repurpose and repropose, and then place over time. So I will choose place over time. Oh, good. Okay, great. We totally coordinated. So place over time for me, because I don't develop, I'm a nonprofit, and I don't know how you guys do what you do. I just create nice parks for communities, hopefully, if we're lucky. But one thing I'm really kind of obsessed with after the ethical redevelopment is honoring the history of place as a tool to engage new communities. So I had the great pleasure of working on a Civic Commons event with the Discovery Center and Strawberry Mansion CDC and Amber Arts, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. where we had done a data collection project, and what we realized was that the near neighbors who were right there next to what will soon be the Discovery Center had no memory and had no realization that there's this beautiful reservoir out there. It's not their fault. It's been closed access for decades. They had no reason to know that anything was up there. So what Amber and the community did was to find those neighborhood folks who remembered and could tell stories about their experiences with the reservoir. A great community steward who trained for the Penn Relays, a young woman who had a little Lover's Lane story to tell. There are all these different stories from these people who were 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 years old. But to take that to then, a 5-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 20-year-old and say, look, this was part of your community and will be again, hopefully. Hopefully they'll be able to generate new memories. They'll be different, but to use to use memory and to use stories as a place for engagement, and to show transitions over time. Hopefully, if it's done right. It's not my project, so I can't take credit for it. But it's sort of one that reminded me of kind of place over time and the power of honoring history and hopefully engaging new audiences. Sort of that explanation.
So for me, I'm gonna go with engaged participation and platforms. And then I think the examples in our work in regards to platforms is, I would say the Institute of Hip Hop Entrepreneurship is a platform. A lot of people might not be aware that we're partners in Pipeline. That's a platform. We have some other initiatives that are in the pipeline, to use the term. We're going to do an engaged trip to Chicago with people who are interested in ethical redevelopment to look at some best practices between cities. And my partner, Megan Dannenberg, is involved in a project that involves looking at cities from a concept called women-led cities. If you look at the number of architects, city planners traditionally, or if you just look at the way the space is looked at, I think if you reference like Jane Jacobs and kind of social intelligence that women may have in regards to family, home, workplace, travel, and how traditionally, whether it was the Garden City or the Emerald City, or the way that cities were designed, it was strictly, predominantly through landowner, upper class, white male perspective. So trying to gather people who bring a larger social intelligence to the cities. So I would look at the recent projects that we've been involved in and kind of looking at them as platforms, and then within them, the engaged participation. And then also I would say it was really interesting to be in the Place Lab Salon while at the same time we were doing the Institute of Hip Hop Entrepreneurship over 9 months. Because I really have started to have a different perspective about collective learning. Even if everyone's not on the same page, or even if everyone doesn't have the same level of aptitude, or if everyone isn't lettered or academic or has a degree. But the power of collectively learning and everyone kind of lifting each other up is something I would like to see replicated again and again through different silos.
So whether it's being the lady at Bach, or the Fairmont CDC guy, the park lady, or just the man in general, right? As we're on the verge of rebuild.
I got all kinds of intersectional issues with that.
Yeah. So we're on the verge of rebuild, right? And it's a $500 million opportunity for the great city of Philadelphia. Knock on wood again, please, for that. It's a great city of Philadelphia to kind of change the course of its future. What, if anything, or hopefully a lot of things, that you gathered from your experience at Place Lab, or through principles, or just through soul searching, that we can apply during rebuild to make that the experience that we all hope and pray, and knock on wood again, for that to be. So like, how the heck do we take Place Lab, 9 trips, 9 principles and make it work in Philadelphia, starting this fall. Go.
I feel like that's one for the park lady, right?
So I'm gonna give the park lady a break. No, you go ahead.
Well, I think that's a great question.
I try, I do it for a living.
I think we're at an unprecedented moment in Philadelphia history, and there's a lot of pressure on the administration, on city council, on everyone else. I think the emphasis and the focus on minority inclusion in the trades, in the planning process, in the design process, in the community engagement process, I think that's been very, very thoughtful and very, very critical. I'm trying to figure out which principle that goes into, maybe engaged participation. But I think it's also a moment in time where we have a national eye on Philadelphia as appreciating the civic assets for what they could be for communities. And I can't think of another example. I mean, Chicago's done some great work, but I can't think of like a 6-year-long commitment to the civic assets in Philadelphia. And I think that's unprecedented, and I think it's absolutely terrifying. So I don't think that necessarily answers your question, but I would say that the minority inclusion is absolutely critical. I think diversifying the opportunity to local community groups, local contractors, et cetera. Again, I just hope it's done right. You have feelings on that?
I got a follow-up question for you.
Okay.
So real life.
Whoa, it's time. Before we go,
I was trying. I knew you were going to do that.
Because I like even, and why I was saying like, let me give the park lady a break, is because like if we're gonna talk about the capital trades, right? And like I don't work for anybody. I'm very fortunate. I work for myself, so I can speak freely. I don't have to be in position. But if we're gonna talk about the capital trades in the city of Philadelphia, we have to talk about historical inequality. And we have to talk about how 70% of the people who work in the capital trades, in the high-paying capital trades, or the building right outside my window, live in New Jersey or the suburbs, right? And most of our political representatives, if you look at where their donations come from, because there's websites where you can do that, their donations do not come from within the city, all right? And there's a history, a deep, deep, deep history of inequality and black and brown people being excluded from the trades. So when someone is spending $500 million, right, that comes from tax dollars, right, we don't have the infrastructure to deal with the amount of work coming through the system. Like, think about that. There aren't enough bonded, black and women-owned construction companies to deal with $500 million and money coming through the pipeline, right? So a lot of people who are in position can't say the things that I'm saying because we're gonna make the best effort to make it inclusive, but we're gonna fucking fail. Be honest, all right? And then for those, God knows how many sites, city council people have to vote on that every year to decide which community and where the money's gonna be spent, right? City council, I don't even want to get into my politics of city council, but they annually approve $4.5 billion budget. Most people can't even identify who their city council person is, all right? So when you start dealing with that deep, deep historical inequality and how black and brown people have been excluded from those opportunities, and then you tell me the city council is going to make sure that these positions are diverse and they go to 40% POC and women-owned companies, and all of this has to be completed in 7 years. 7 years, right? We have probably 100 years of people not being included in the capital trades, and we're gonna solve that problem, and we're gonna get $500 million through that system, with 40% of that going to women and minority-owned businesses. Now, that's a lofty goal. I would like to see it succeed, but I gotta see a lot more commitment. And I would think if we go into most of our communities and you talk to people about this and you ask them if they know what rebuild is, they're gonna look at you with a blank face. So that's my 2 cents.
All right, Kevin, you're up, buddy.
So I think you're absolutely right. There's no realistic way that the trades can meet the diversity requirements that the city's going to set, which is, you know, that's not an issue that's going to be solved in 7 years. You're absolutely right. Going back to your original question, as far as how can we, which of these kind of principles or which vocabulary can we use to kind of connect with the rebuild project? I don't know if that was your original question, but I'll make it your original question.
No, please do.
Yeah.
That was it, yeah.
But thinking through some of those challenges, what I guess I would say I would hope or be optimistic for is that we take this opportunity because of, you know, just as Jennifer was saying, just because of how this has really never been done before on this scale, that we take this opportunity to create those pedagogical moments throughout the process. Which is to say, making time throughout the process to learn from what you've done so far and continue to constantly improve the process. Because there's going to be things that we learn in year 1 that we can apply to year 2, and vice versa over the next 7 years. It's also an opportunity to engage folks who might not have great access to the trades right now, and and I think my personal opinion here is that that's the win that I think we more realistically could win, is using this as leverage to change access to the trades, not to necessarily expect that we're going to hit the diversity you know, requirements in this single project, but that we use this project to fundamentally provide greater access to the trades for the people of the city. And I think we can do that through you know, making time for those pedagogical moments throughout the next 7 years or so.
So I think everybody has said incredibly impressive things, so I'm not sure how to follow it. But I think that the big kind of takeaway, and perhaps trying to end on a more optimistic note, is about just access, generally speaking. And I think that means giving opportunity to non-traditional companies, organizations, community groups, artists, initiators, whatever they might be, that are, to be honest, I think going to have a hard time navigating the RFP process that has just come out. But if there's a hope, that would be mine, that access generally.
So for the last 15 minutes, time is yours. Jim Burnett, West Philly Financial, is going to kick it off. I recommend that you do not sit still, but make sure you get your hand up so I can get your question in, all right? Because you got the park lady, you got a CDC guy. If you want to start a business, that Bob clearly can do that. And Ty will co-sign for pretty much anything. All right, so we got 15 minutes, let's make it worthwhile.
That is the fairest from the truth. So, Rebuild's a nice project, but it's like pennies compared to Schuylkill Yards and 30th Street Station when you're talking about $13 billion worth over the next 25 years. So, is 25 years enough time to make this work? Because at some point in time, we need to make this stuff work.
So one of the questions that always comes to mind when I think about this is, I don't know of a on-ramp for someone who's in the Philadelphia school system to become a part of the trade unions.
Now it's a beer garden.
It's a what?
Now it's a beer garden.
What's a beer?
The on-ramp would have been.
Oh, okay, right.
Yeah, it would have been. I'm sorry. No, that is.
She means like a trade school, like those like skills trading systems.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I'm looking at also is the fact that that was a public program as opposed to private. There is a lot more dollars in private money that are going to be coming into this city, especially if potentially Amazon shows up here. There's just a lot of private money, and we just don't seem to make the shift from private developers or private owners beyond just the city. And we don't hold them accountable either from the developer scale, as opposed to, yeah, we want to hold the, I'm sorry, am I getting off on a tangent? We're not holding, we want to hold the contractors or the unions responsible, but they don't make the decisions. The owners of the projects are the ones that make the decisions. So if they wanted to hire people that look like us, they would hire people that look like us if they are able to do the job. But I just don't see it happening.
Can I say one thing?
Say 10. We got 16 minutes to go.
No, I mean, I entirely agree and think that trade education is incredibly important. I don't know why Bach closed. I believe that, you know, the things that were being taught at Bach were incredible. And, you know, we weren't involved in that decision, but I totally agree with it on a separate and personal note in that I believe that we do need that, more of that type of education. I think that, you know, we look at university and debt in this country, it's very clear that, you know, that we need that.
So, just to speak.
I didn't do any of that.
Just to speak about vocations, Bach, all of the, I think, frankly, the drama that ensued when you first launched. Oddly enough, on 2 occasions when I visited Bach, when I was dropped off and when I was picked up, my Uber drivers were people who had attended Bach when they were younger. And they would ask me, like, what's going on in there, right? And similar to how someone else, I think the people from Detroit mentioned that they tend to interact more because they're part of Place Lab than if they were in Philly. So I had known of Lindsay, and kind of we'd be in rooms like this, but I feel like we talked more when I was in Chicago. And if I were gonna be super frank, I've become more of a fan of her courage, and you know, basically, like, she's not gonna be able to get out of the building for a long time. And you know, developers are about flipping. You know what I mean? Like, I'm out of this project in 5 years. And then, if I'm gonna be super frank, I've heard how there's almost, like, more so than the people in South Philadelphia, or the Southeast Asian community down there, the Latino community, or the traditional African American community down there. The biggest critics I've heard of Lindsay are people that I would honestly say might even envy, or they have this like hipster intelligentsia ethics. They're like, I'm not messing with that because it's gentrification, right? And if it were just a traditional developer, that would either be sold for scrap, destroyed, made into condos, or stuff like that. And so the thing that I would say, out of having the ability to hear her perspective, visit the space, and look at it with fresh eyes, because I would say, if I were just reading about it in the paper, I would probably be a larger critic than I am from thinking about it like, oh, you gotta do a bar because your electric bill is more than like most people annual programming is, right? So again, to give credence to the collective learning experience of Chicago or Place Lab is oftentimes being in our silos or looking at things through the lens of our own agendas, you don't have empathy, right? And one thing that we talk about at Little Giant a lot is that you can't really have dialogue unless you have empathy. Amen?
I have a question. You have some questions?
So I was going to just say, based on the things that were just said with respect to rebuild, someone who has lived in another horrible city, Boston, Massachusetts, that struggles with the same deep inequality and the preference for private, huge developments over and sort of beverage taxes and fun things on incredibly poor people to pay for city parks. The question of empathy with regards to the principles with the big developments that are sort of marketed to be for the civic good for the city. I just want to say, and with respect to the building trades, there are 2 things. So first of all, there are no women of color on this panel, and when people say, "What are we going to do about those building trades?" but y'all couldn't get a non-black or a black woman on the panel. But wait, no, I just want to finish this other. I just wanted to say that as like a thing that maybe it like pinged in my mind when you said that. Mostly because I look around this room and I just met anyway. But that I thought that was ironic, useful, and important, and that when we're asking people sort of to my larger question about ethical redevelopment, if we're asking people to come to the table and we're talking about agendas and empathy, if the people we're bringing to the table want more than development or redevelopment, if they want real liberation, are you actually able to hear what that is instead of talking to them to reposition themselves about empathy or to get to know developers personally? For the folks that are at the table inviting, talking to the people that have been invited, right? Because that's a power differential that I think we need to hold and recognize. How willing are you to think not just about redevelopment, but also sort of developing yourselves out of a job? If we're talking about Philadelphia, Detroit, Chicago, cities where people, low-key, high-key, are mad radical, right? Especially Philly, out here in these streets, wild and we talk about Move 9, not anachronistic. If we're actually willing to do that, to develop ourselves out of a job, how willing are the people that invite quote-unquote us to the table willing to listen to us when we say, as adorable as this project is, maybe we do just need, for example, a vocational high school in South Philly. And that was sort of what, I mean, I think I was gonna ask another question, but that was what was inspired by the last give and take that just came. If we're talking about ethical redevelopment, the whole point of these principles, and we're inviting, you've invited us, metaphorically and literally, to this table. If we say we want to tear it all down and start it off totally, how willing, individually and collectively in organizations, I know you can't speak for them necessarily, how willing are you really willing to listen to those of us that want something more than a wood shop or a bar? Yeah, sorry.
No, let them answer, but somebody can answer that.
I can just speak to the first part. In Chicago, more so than I've ever experienced in Philadelphia, the conversations, the whole of the cohort, there were a lot of Black women voices leading the programming, or designing the programming, or hosting the events. I could say that we could do a much better job of diversifying panels, audiences, advisory boards, particularly in the organizations that service the poor, because I appreciate your perspective. It's like, are people willing to, basically work themselves out of a job? Because I think if you look at a lot of CDCs in the city, the executive staff or the people in power don't come from the community. And then everyone talks about, like, how do you develop, the community? But if you got a 5 or 10-year plan, there's a 20-year-old or an 18-year-old who could be a staff member within a very short period of time. So I appreciate your perspective, and I will say that we probably need to double down on thinking about ways to make transformative change in systems versus having a traditional missionary perspective of engaging with communities.
We have one more question, and we're going to throw it to Michelle Freeman. Tempest, take us home.
All right.
Make it good.
All right.
Or great.
All right, I'm gonna try. Tempest from 52nd Street. Big up to the king, big up to everybody. So 2 points, just doing that right now. So the Enterprise Center, its whole mission, especially around school yards, around rebuild, is really trying to get people, we don't even have the language. I think that was something that was brought up in the film, like, what is bond education? Do I need a t-shirt line, or do I need to get into a BEP, right? And how do we rework that? I mean, which kind of leads to, so if you guys are working in trades, know people that are working in the trades and they need to level up, build capacity, you need to come. And that's not just, you need to come, you need to be really figuring out what that language is, right? So moving on to the question, I think that we have like a really fraught kind of conversations when it comes to this work, because we're all doing work in spaces of change, spaces that are radically changing. I have a question about narrative. Right, we have a narrative about how gentrification works, about how power works, about how we can engage economically in these spaces. How is your work either pushing against that, or how is it being reframed by the experience that you had in City Lab? Where do you see the work going, the work that you've been doing? I hope that it's been fundamentally changed by what you experienced. How do you hope that it flips the narrative of what you're pushing against? I hope that's all right.
Amazing. Goes hard for you. So we'll flip a coin. Who takes that question? Good job, Lance.
Sorry, I can help you with okay, so I think that you raised some really good points, and I think those are really big challenges, and I don't know if they're going to take easy answers or easy solutions or quick solutions, and I think that there has been an acknowledgement that what we have been doing when we approach development hasn't worked in all regards. I think that's the first and most important step, is acknowledging a problem. I also think that we have to be conscious that we also don't push away development or opportunity for fear of repercussions of it. I think it's about raising the bar, really, on what we expect from a private developer, what we expect from any project really actually happening in the city. I would argue it shouldn't just be private development, that any project should be held to a higher level of expectation about how their project impacts their neighborhood and their community and how it works with that community. And I don't know if all of us have the right solutions for that, but I think we're all trying to do that in whatever tools and situations and economic challenges or I guess boundaries that we all have and set. And some of that might just be as simple as, you know, one of the things that we've talked a lot about is that when we talk about engagement, we talk about processes that don't actually engage a lot of the people. When I go to my local civic association meeting at 6 p.m. on a Wednesday night, there's a very specific type of person that shows up, and it is not the entire neighborhood. And so something as simple as just sitting outside and giving coffee out on a cold day is a different way of communicating and a way of breaking down boundaries and barriers that people might not feel that they have the opportunity to talk to somebody about what's going on. Or I talk to people all the time when I say, hey, are you interested in knowing what's going on in this building? And they say, oh no, my kid doesn't go to school there. I'm like, I know your kid doesn't go to school there, it's not school. But, you know, it's about also just trying to come to a conversation on somebody's ground, on somebody's turf, trying to do it in a setting that you can actually have a face-to-face conversation, and in a setting where you can actually listen. And, you know, I don't know if that's gonna totally solve the problem, but I think we have to try to at least have a conversation, and we have to do it through non-traditional channels, because I think the existing channels that we enforce or say are our community engagement don't always engage the community.
Okay.
Sure. No, I was gonna wrap. All right, I'll keep it quick. I think there is one sort of very real example or takeaway that I took away from the ethical redevelopment and looking at how we do business at Fairmount CDC. And so for a long time the conversation was we just need to create a clean, safe, built environment that attracts business. Well lit. Right? Exactly. Yeah. So we finished our streetscape last year. We have bright new LEDs. Great. We're sweeping the streets every day, so we have clean streets. We're working with our police district. There's patrols and foot patrols. Okay, great. So the foundation's there. But as a small organization, it's very easy for us to say, okay, we've built that foundation. Now we just need to keep that foundation strong and constantly focus on the foundation without thinking about what that next step is. And I think, for a community like West Girard Avenue, there needs to be a very intentional recruitment of new businesses, or the sort of really kind of strong support systems for growing home-based businesses from the neighborhood and having them fill those storefronts. So we've had 2 storefronts filled from Enterprise Center clients, which has been really great. But I'll be the first to admit, that's happenstance. That wasn't intentional on our part. I'm glad they're there. I've learned a lot from bringing them to the Avenue. But I think, as an organization, we need to not just hide behind the sort of operational wall. We have a small budget, small staff. We mastered the foundation, and we're going to continue to master the foundation, but really challenge ourselves to take that next step and be really intentional about who we are working to attract to that avenue. And to be perfectly honest, a lot of that work, and the really kind of the hard part of it is that can't just be me and my board deciding who that is, right? So it's not just about us saying okay, we need to work with the Enterprise Center more to get entrepreneurs onto West Girard Avenue. We need to figure out a process and really kind of create a system for how we are working with the neighborhood to fill those storefronts, whether it's from the neighborhood or working with the neighborhood to identify the right fit for the neighborhood. And I used to push back on that concept a little bit because I used, it used to be the neighborhood can want what it wants all at once, but the market is going to put that person in that storefront. But I do think there's programs that we can leverage in really significant ways to be a bit more intentional about developing that retail mix. And so I think that's the next challenge, the next step for Fairmount CDC, and that really came from a few trips out to Chicago and really starting to reevaluate what we're doing and how much we can do.
I'm going to be really quick because you're going to say really powerful, impactful, memorable things, and I'm going to say really stupid, quick things. Oh, no, it's not here. He was my.
It's the sweater. Don't get
It's the
worse.
sweater.
It's the sweater around his neck. That's all it is. That's what it is. If you had a sweater, you would feel the same as that. I swear. You'll be all right.
I think two super quick things. I think one, we really need to be honest in the conversation, and I know that's something very new and very uncomfortable for me, but that's just where we have to start. And two, we need to hold ourselves accountable, but then report back, right? So I made a promise to the Parkside community that we would have a certain minority participation rate in our project. We're tracking that, I'm reporting that. If we screw up, I'm honest about it. I can give addresses of where folks live, how many hours they're working, what they're doing. We have community eyes on the street, but being really honest and holding ourselves accountable. We haven't done that. We don't do that enough. The city doesn't do that enough. Nonprofits don't do that enough. So that's just a quick thing. I mean, I think it is something we can absolutely do, but we just need to really emphasize it and really make a promise and hold ourselves to it and be honest when you screw up. Okay. That's my proposal.
Cool. So I'm going to leave you guys with a recommendation. Two books that were really powerful for me this year. One was The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. It basically describes like housing policy over the last 100 years. From even the single family home designation was designed so that African Americans could build homes in certain neighborhoods, or like the first housing associations were designed around segregation. And I think to really work in this space and do the work in community development, you need to have some historical context to how the systems were created and where they started from the beginning. And then the other book I would recommend is Mindy Fullilove, Root Shock. And one of my favorite analogies she uses in that book is she describes that people, when they're burn victims, when over 70% of your body is burned, you have a very low probability of survival because your skin is your largest organ and it protects you from all types of disease, and it's basically like your ecosystem protector. And then she describes how through urban renewal and FHA policy and HUD policy, how communities had a erasure of cultural space, and how through the deconstruction of Black communities, there were all kinds of things that we don't really think about. That even the concept of jazz spaces or soul spaces or spaces where music was created, when Black communities were deconstructed, the spaces where we celebrated, where we got married, where we just experienced culture, were eradicated, and then there was a promise that when those slums were tore down, people would be allowed to come back. And then a lot of those communities sat vacant for 10 years, and then the government gifted that property to for-profit developers, and how it just eradicated the bonds of community, and how there's no way to recover from that. I can't express enough how important it is to have historical context. To some extent, our so-called ghettos were manufactured environments with government-sanctioned intrinsic bias policy. And until all of us have an understanding of that, we will not be able to really engage as a community in the totality of what a city is. That's it.
Well, I want to be mindful of, I don't know if this is on. Oh, I want to be mindful of everybody's time. I want to thank all of our special guests, our Philly representatives of the Ethical Redevelopment Salon Series. And I want to thank all of you for being here, being interested and having conversation, asking questions. You know, most of us aren't going anywhere. We're in it here in Philly. We have to keep asking more questions.